I'm joined today by a distinguished panel. To my left is Mike Burman, who is a serial entrepreneur and has a great history and track record of starting and developing companies internationally. Martin Chambers, to his left, who is currently the Vice President of Sales for Rox Medical, but has also worked across many continents. Martha Goldberg-Aaronson, who has experience running international businesses. And then finally, Andy Weiss, who is the President and CEO of Coaxia and has recently run a clinical trial internationally. So why don't I start the discussion, if I can, just with a simple big question that perhaps I will give to Andy, which is when and how, just as an umbrella, would you consider looking at markets outside of your home market for any one of the three areas, or perhaps all three, and then we can perhaps go down into each area.
The way I look at the quote markets outside the United States by stage is there's opportunity outside the United States in each stage. And speaking to an investor audience, as you're looking at investing in companies, there are just appropriate times for them to go U.S. Mike really should talk a lot about, Israel for technology standpoint, Europe from technology standpoint. There's a lot of great technology outside the United States, but oftentimes there's less opportunity to get a management team and develop that technology, go through clinicals. Clinicals, there's tremendous good clinical research that goes on outside the U.S., Europe, Asia, and India as well. And then from a revenue standpoint, as we've heard earlier, we talk a lot about CoreValve. But there are other companies that, while waiting for the U.S. regulatory path to clarify for their companies, they can pursue intelligent revenue generation outside the United States. So I'd say you kind of march down those three, technology, clinical, and revenue, kind of by stage.
So Mike, could I start with you and put you on the spot and ask you to perhaps talk about technology, when to look to international markets for?
Well, if you're an investor and you're looking for interesting new things, then my recommendation would be to go outside the United States. Because while there's a ton of innovation in the United States, there are certain places around the world where there are things being invented that are different and that are more innovative, more creative, and in some cases more suited to markets outside the United States as well. It's a hard thing to do, especially for venture investors, because it requires getting on airplanes and working in different cultures and things like that. Andy mentioned Israel. I spent a fair amount of time in Israel. I'd lived there after college for a number of years, and I'm on the board of a company there, so I go back and forth maybe 4 or 5 times a year, and I get exposed to technologies and venture investors there and new deals. And while there's about $10 billion in venture capital under management in Israel by about 50 venture capital funds that are based in Israel, today a majority of the venture capital being invested into Israeli companies comes from venture capital funds based outside of Israel. Mm-hmm. And of course, Israel is just one example. Look at China, which is, last I checked, a pretty big country. A lot of stuff going on there. It does require a certain level of commitment or willingness to invest in doing what it takes to be successful. I don't think you can do it on a truly part-time basis and be effective at it. Otherwise, you're just, I think, going to be setting yourself up for failure.
If you reflect back on the panel discussions prior, when you think about what Chris Johnson had to say or Pete McNerney, the question was discussed, or the topic was around the FDA and the FDA becoming a lot more difficult and challenging. And I think they both made the same comment, and that is the value of going outside U.S. is to be able to get to proof of concept, to evaluate your value proposition, your therapy outcomes in a very controlled environment. We're in very special times now when you think from an investing standpoint. If you approach it from a conventional manner, then why do you expect to get different outcomes? You've got to think about it differently. Everybody thinks about going international through distributors. Why would you put the reputation of your company in the hands of a third party? If you think about what you're trying to do, you're trying to get an early insight within a commercial environment of the value of your proposition. And think about that value in terms of using that to structure your PMA submission. The PMA is very, very expensive, very time-consuming. You bet all your horses on what you think are the right dynamics, only to find later that everything's changed. So it's not a case of whether you do international commercial operations. It's why and how. And that how is very, very important. I would not personally go through distributors. I would not personally go to key opinion leaders. They are key opinion leaders because they have a negative opinion as well as a positive opinion. What you want to do is, within a very controlled environment, go and explore all of the aspects of what you think is your value proposition. Learn about what you don't know and learn about what you think you know. And so take that and use that then and reflect it backwards. You can do that very cost effectively.
Martin, how does the cost of capital affect into the decision whether to use distributors or not?
I think it's a vital, important thing that you do that. The cost of capital in terms of distributors, the problem I have there is that there is a time and place for distributors. I think in your early time, it's very, very important to go and learn yourself about the marketplace, understand your dynamics, and then engage distributors. I think all too often we think we understand what our product offering is about. We think we understand what our model's about. We engage distributors who are engaged in the marketplace, and they have a totally different perspective on what they want to achieve. They want to achieve money fast in a short period of time because if you are worth anything, you'll get acquired.
Picking up on what you said, Martin, I think for investors these days, there's a lot of thought about, and I'll pick up on the FDA comment. We just finished a randomized trial. We'll see our results later this year. And we're putting plans in place to do some pilot marketing in Europe. This is at our company, Coaxia. And what's important for investors, and I think board members to know, is that Europe and the idea of going to market in Europe has the same challenges that you have in the United States. In the European markets, there's an active competitive market for most medical devices and medical therapy areas. You need to have clinical data in order for physicians to adopt your therapy. Increasingly, this is randomized controlled trials, whether we call them 510K or PMA in the United States. You want randomized data that has statistical significance. You need to get coverage and payment in the European countries. The payers want randomized data. They want publications just like CMS does. And there are existing channels through distributors and direct channels. A friend of mine is running a company and they're going to market in Europe, and they said, one of our challenges, there's an existing distributor or an existing channel that's keeping us away from physicians. Sounds like the United States again. So the U.S., going OUS in the United States, going OUS in revenue makes sense, but you've got to recognize that gravity still works over there, and you have to go through the same blocking and tackling. It takes time. It's not just falling off the log, start getting revenue there. It takes time, investment. It takes a year or two to get traction in order to generate anything significant.
It's very easy when you sit in the United States to just say, well, here's the strategy in Europe or here's the strategy in Asia. And again, to your point, you have to remember, not only do you want randomized clinical trials, but you may have to do that country by country in many instances. More and more, I think you're seeing that each particular country wants data from their own country. And certain countries don't like the data from somewhere else. And again, I think you need to be pretty strategic about which countries you go to when, and I agree with Martin, I think the how you do it is really critical.
We ran a randomized controlled trial in stroke and ischemic strokes, and we conducted that trial at 75 centers around the world, predominantly in Europe and the United States. A third of our centers ended up being in Europe, about a third of our patients. And I would say in general, many of the European hospitals are extremely well set up to do very, very high quality clinical trial work. I would in many ways rather conduct clinical trials in Germany than in the United States. They're just very protocol driven. And so for us that worked very, very well. If you go outside Western Europe and the United States, the issue with running trials is if you want to randomize in particular, the control patients have to get the same kind of care in those countries that they do in Western Europe or the United States in order for the control patients to be viewed as comparable, because you can't pool data when a control patient is given a very, very different treatment across your clinical trial. So with regard to places like China and India, other of the, quote, third world countries, it's great to do clinical trial work there, but it's very hard to pool that data with data from Western Europe and the United States. So early feasibility data, early feasibility trials make sense. Certain subsegments work well in those countries. But in the end, if you want European or U.S. FDA approval, you got to get most of your patients from those two continents. I don't know, Martha and Mike, that's your experience as well.
I agree.
Yeah, pretty much every company I'm involved with, early pilot clinical trials are done outside the U.S. I can just run down the countries where we've done them. Australia, Argentina, Chile, India, Bulgaria, and England.
You know, the bottom line is, from an investment standpoint, is creating a compelling, can't get my words out, sorry, a compelling value proposition. That's what it's about. And really focusing on that. If you're an acquirer, what you want to see is that there is a therapy proposition or a value that you can escalate and obviously increase to a significant, meaningful value. So who you go and work with is very important. And I liken it to my 16-year-old son. The biggest crisis in his life is who you go to the semi-formal with. That creates the biggest stir. It's the same when you start internationally. What's really important is you control the experiences. So doing what you do in a very controlled environment, who you choose to work with is very important, because you've just signaled that's what you stand for. And what they stand for is exactly what you will get as a reputation. And then managing every experience so that you get not the number of dollars, not the number of doctors, not the number of centers. It's the quality of the adoption that really counts. That's what will drive the valuation. So initially, there's a gap. I think distributors play a role, but I'm the international salesperson. I will take a US team and I'll position myself out there, and we will do a very small, controlled commercial experience to evaluate exactly what this means before we scale up. And that's the intermediate step that I really think in this day and age is very important on how we approach the international markets. That's just my perspective.
Martin, maybe I could ask you to just talk a little bit about what are proper expectations and how you would go about it and managing those expectations.
Well, revenue is always interesting. We heard earlier on that you're not going to earn a significant amount of money in international markets. Having said that, there are examples where that exactly occurred. I think what it is that you're looking at a model that you can prove that you can generate revenue in a profitable manner, that the adoption is very interesting and attention-getting. And I think that you thinking about that and controlling where you go to be able to prove that and to be able to refine that model so you can scale up, that's what a potential acquirer is going to look at. When I do the multiplication, I can see that this has a significant amount of value. Recent experience, not giving anything away. I mean, Ablation Frontiers was acquired after just 3 years commercial, and the final year was just around the $10 million run rate. And you look at that sort of evolution, it wasn't the pure dollars. It was that the dollars that were done within the given centers and the given environment that you choose to do business in. And so it's creating that value. It's creating a good return and understanding what generates that.
I think, again, when you think about, in your case, the acquirer at the end of the day, I think that's right on. And I think what some of the strategics are looking for, right, is that the quality of the centers, as you talked about, not necessarily all the revenue, but I think, as you also talked about, the how you've gone about developing those markets. Is there market acceptance? Who are the centers you're working with? Quality of data, quality of the people. That's what matters.
Just keep in mind that it consumes cash to launch a product outside the U.S. It doesn't create cash initially. So you have to be looking and saying, will I get a return on that investment? And the way you get a return is by having some high quality results that meet or exceed expectations, because if you have a big plan and you underachieve that plan, then you have not enhanced shareholder value. As Machiavelli said, if you're going to go try to kill the king, you better kill him.
When accessing international markets for the whole range of things, can you perhaps talk about how you manage investor and board level expectations?
Well, it's a very tricky thing to do. I mean, it's also managing your own expectations. Sure. I mean, nobody has a crystal ball and knows what's going to happen in any market, and you got to spend a lot of time out before making any decisions to invest heavily. You want to do a good scouting operation where you're out in those markets, talking with physicians, understanding the reimbursement environment, understanding what distributors can or cannot do for you. It's unlikely that distributors will do a lot of heavy lifting, but they do open doors, and they know customers, and they can ship and take returns and invoice and all that kind of stuff for you. And so you better do a good job of scouting the environment and then creating realistic expectations that you can meet or exceed, and then have a financial plan that you look at and say, is this investment worth it compared with other investments that I could do, or is it not worth the dilution to raise that extra money in order to go after this opportunity? It's kind of like doubling down. If you do a good job of it, you will create a lot of shareholder value. And everybody's talking about CorVel. They're not the only company in the history of the medical device business that has done this very well. There are literally dozens of companies that have done a good job of this outside the U.S. It was out of vogue for a number of years, up until a few years ago, and I think it's becoming back in vogue because the alternative of waiting until you're ready to sell in the U.S. is just untenable. It's just a company is unsustainable.
Right.
If you say, I'm going to wait for 7 years until we get FDA approval, and in the meantime, I'm going to do nothing.
I'll use our company just as a generic example. We conducted a trial. We finished enrollment. We hope to submit our PMA if the trial results merit that in the fall. So submit the PMA, then you've got the dialogue with the FDA, panel meeting, time after panel, and hopefully after that PMA approval. Then after that, or in the meantime, you're trying to get CPT codes, private payer coverage, CMS coverage, et cetera. So you know that process, even once you're done with your trial, is 1, 2, 3 years. And of course, the company doesn't just idle for those 3 years. One of the things you do in the States is you can do a continued access trial, which means you keep the product device therapy out in clinical use in a trial setting, but you can't really generate enough revenue from that to cover the trial costs. So while you're kind of waiting that 2 or 3 years, once your trial's done, results are published, you can go to market in Europe. So that, my general expectation, our guidance to the board is it takes about a year to get going in Europe. They don't like to hear that, but in order to get the in-country trials going or in-country coverage, pick your team, et cetera, start getting that going, that takes a good year. And maybe year 2, you can start to see a little bit of a revenue ramp. But let's say we at Coaxia go out and hire a dozen people in Europe. We can't compete with the revenue growth expectations that a J&J or Medtronic would have. So you have to set expectations about what you think you can generate in that time and how long. I think it's kind of a year to get going, and in year 2 you can start showing something, and then you decide whether you're going direct and indirect, et cetera. But as an investor, think you're done with your trial 2, 3 years in the United States before you can get going. In the interim time, you can do productive work in Europe. But the purpose of that work is to show adoption by good sites, and that the technology can be used in everyday use, and hopefully that will help your exit value in a strategic sale.
There is that time. I mean, obviously with the US, when you do your pivotal study, you've got this gap. But then you look at the international markets. Let's look at the CE mark. You can get the CE mark without clinical data in certain markets. You can get it with limited clinical data with most products. The problem there is that, of course, and you get CE mark, by the way, for the functionality of the device, not the indication. The problem with that is that you now have some clinical data. There's an attraction to generate revenue. And by the way, you can be cost neutral within 12 months with a small operation in international. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I agree there's other companies other than CorVel. But what you do there is critically important. It is of high value. If you think from a VC standpoint, you've been putting your money into this company, you're now 5, 6 years out. Do I keep doing this? Where are we at? So there's a perfect opportunity in that controlled environment, and that's why I say I believe there is a proof of concept stage to be able to reinforce the value, reinvigorate the board, give clear indication that this has real adoption and real value, and that in itself will help for further fundraising and help for fueling and giving the right time to that that you do in the U.S.?
We, you know, at our company, we've been in touch with many of the corporates, and maybe Martha, you can comment as well. And when I ask the corporate players like Chad Cornell mentioned earlier, I asked them what would make us a more attractive acquisition target. Let's say we've finished our trial, the results are positive, and what they really would like us to do is develop the market, start developing the market. They don't need us to hire salespeople. They need us to hire sort of those field marketing people that could plug into their sales force. And that adds a lot of value to them, because what the corporates want to do is they want to acquire that in-place field market development team. And in some cases, if they don't have a channel in this new acquisition area, then they'll want to hire the channel itself. In our case, they don't need to hire a channel, they have one, but it's the field market people. So as you're thinking, as investors in the companies you're looking at or companies, you can sort of tune a little bit what your venture investment dollars go into in the field in terms of what the strategics will want to buy when they buy you. And that's affected some of our strategic decisions a little bit. I don't know if, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And again, I mean, each investment, you know, or acquisition from the big companies is done for different reasons, right? I mean, sometimes it's just to round out a technology portfolio. I think, you know, probably in the case you're talking about, where it's significant market development work, there's always this great debate going on, right, about market development and who does the heavy lifting of market development, and does the company that does all the initial heavy lifting necessarily reap all the benefit if 2 or 3 fast followers come in and say, hey, thanks for developing that market, now I'm going to come in and grab a bunch of share. And we've all seen that story over the years play out. But I think to your point, certainly the big companies do appreciate a certain level of that market development getting started, because it's a huge investment to do that kind of market development. It takes a long time, generally, you know, 1 to 3 times longer than anybody initially thinks it's going to take. And again, depending on how quickly other players get into that space, you may or may not have a really nice initial lead there. So I think your point is well taken. You know, lots of sales reps and feet on the street the large companies generally have, but how to develop a market in a brand new space don't necessarily hold that expertise. So I think, as you said, to be strategic about that in your case, as you're developing that, is critical and can really add significant value to you in a buyout.
Quite often, the term OUS is used interchangeably with Europe, and I think we've shown with a lot of clinical trials being operated in many markets and technology coming from many sources. Perhaps we could just talk about some of these markets and the dynamics of them.
As daunting as it is to go to Europe, it's even more daunting to consider going everywhere else in the world. You know, it's true that 97% of the people in the world don't live in the United States, or whatever the number is, but it is hard to access Korea and Taiwan and Australia and Singapore and Argentina and Brazil and Canada and Turkey, and you know, these are, and guess what, as Steve Martin said, they have a different word for everything in those countries. So it's not so simple to go after those markets. I'm involved with one, although it is interesting, the different perspective. You know, Americans, I think, are more daunted by that. I'm on the board of an Israeli aesthetics company, and we launched a product outside the United States in 2005, and we went after all those markets, and we hired distributors, and we had region managers in different regions of the world that managed those distributors. We built our revenue up to a little over $20 million a year outside the U.S. We still don't have FDA approval, thank you very much. Here we are 5 years later. It's always been about 1 year away. You know, the mentality of Israelis is that, you know, they're pretty close to a lot of those markets. They go on vacation in these places. After they're done with the army, they go and travel in South America. It's not really quite as foreign to them as it is to Americans, who I think are a little bit more just cozy and comfortable sticking with what they know. I mean, the CEO of that company lived in Paris for 4 years, lived in Korea for 4 years, so he's been around the world, and you know, going to Korea is just fine with him. And guess what? There's like 60 million people in Korea. Where'd they come from? And so there are opportunities outside of Europe. And it is not, OUS is not just Europe, but certainly for a small company, it's very hard to do everything all at once. And you can get spread too thin, which, by the way, we did at this company. But there are a lot of people in places. I mean, there's almost 200 million people in Brazil. And Brazil has a greater geographic area than the continental United States. I bet most of you didn't know that. It's a big country, a lot of people, and in the case of an aesthetics company, they actually care a lot about how they look. So we found Brazil to be a very attractive market for this. So there's a lot of opportunity out there, but you got to prioritize where you're going after.
I think your point is very well made about spreading yourself too thin. What's your objective? You've got to come back to what's your goal? What are you trying to achieve? If you're trying to deliver compelling results in a very controlled manner, then it's natural that you go to the best opportunities. And Europe is sophisticated, developed. There's some really good markets there that you can start your process, you can control it and grow it. And it depends on your long-term objectives. I mean, if you want to get acquired, I mean, there's no point in spreading yourself thinly and taking on those markets where most of the population live, but it's very difficult to do business. So I liken what you're doing is like the person who's spinning plates. They put one up and they spin it and add another one, and they go back and add another one and tickle them all. You build from a center base and you control that expansion. And it comes down to your goals and objectives. So don't be tempted by those places where there's great reimbursement, but it's a 7-year regulatory process. Go and do something, do it well, execute with excellence, learn about it, learn how to scale up, and invest very carefully on that. But you can get some great results in a short period of time.
I would just add one thing too, and I agree with you, Mike. I think it is quite daunting for Americans to be, sitting here somewhere in the United States and thinking about expansion all around the globe. I also agree you don't want to spread yourself too thin. I think, obviously you have very limited resources. You need to invest them well. So I do think you need a focused strategy. The only point I would add, though, I think there really is a large and growing pool of talented people all around the globe working in this industry. And I worked and met lots of them when I lived in Europe. I know there's people in this room who've lived and worked all over the world, and I think there are a lot of people who love that and would love to continue to do that. So just as we said, it's so important to make sure that you're working with the right sites. Obviously, the people you hire or choose to do some type of partnership is really critical. But I'm quite an optimist that actually in some really key parts of the world, there's enormous talent and people who would love to be part of an entrepreneurial team building a new market. So I think the talent's out there.
How about India and China? Any thoughts on those as markets to acquire technology or to commercialize? I'll look to Andy.
The way I look at India and China is there's, and I won't be saying anything that's a surprise, billions of people, a very, very broad disparity in income, and associated with that, a very, very broad disparity in access to medical care. And so there are large opportunities to treat many, many people with very low-cost healthcare solutions. When you get into the high-technology healthcare solutions, I ran the neuro business for Medtronic. I remember we were introducing deep brain stimulation into China. Obviously, it's a small market initially. There will be 3, 4, 5 hospitals in the whole country who can deliver, an electrode to the subthalamic nucleus. So you need to just assess those markets based on, the demographics, access to healthcare, and how your technology fits.
We've heard a lot about harmonization and perhaps delays at the FDAs and models of companies who've done it well. I would ask of you each individually, if you were to look out 5 years from now, this balance of US versus OUS, would you paint the picture for the future? Starting with you, Mike.
Oh, boy. Unfortunately, I'm pessimistic about the FDA. For the last 10 years, it's been getting harder and harder and taking longer and longer and costing more and more to get through the FDA. I don't see anything changing that, unfortunately. The same is true outside the U.S. Actually, it's been getting harder and more expensive to get approvals, but it's been happening at a much slower rate. So it's still, if anything, it's relatively speaking, it's gotten easier in Europe to, because the FDA has gotten worse faster than Europe. So I think that increasingly, from a commercialization perspective, companies large and small will be increasingly seeking commercial opportunities outside the U.S. earlier and earlier and earlier relative to the U.S. So I would give a bit of advice to anybody in the audience, which is brush up on your French and get to know the international markets, because I think they will be more and more important to the commercial success of every medical device company, in large or small.
Martin, 2015.
I exactly agree. I mean, I totally agree with yourself. I think it's very good, and merci beaucoup, monsieur. I would certainly say this. That
What do you say?
Merci beaucoup. You say je vous en prie. So
What he said.
Yeah.
I'm an American.
I'm Minnesotan, you can tell by the accent. So if you just take what Mike said, which is absolutely true, the FDA is going to get tougher and tougher. Look at your timelines. Think about the criticality associated with the PMA. Think about the safety feasibility study opportunity in Europe. Think about then doing multi-center studies in a very controlled environment, and using that as well as early commercial experience, but in a very controlled environment, to be able to refine your PMA. Because if life's going to get tougher and you put your money on the horses and you get it slightly wrong, we know of many situations where the clinical study's done remarkably well, the outcomes are really strong, the FDA says, no, you're not getting approval. You've really got to take those opportunities that are provided to you outside of the US, do it in a controlled manner, as I mentioned. I do agree that it's about timing with distributors, but that timing for me is a bit later. I'd like to know myself first, before I know what my model is, before I engage somebody else to take my reputation, my opportunities, and then apply it for me. So again, I think we're all on the same page, but danke schön, and over to you.
Again, not much disagreement there either. I think I'd be a little cautious on simply boning up on the French, because I think it was, almost 10 years to get an ICD reimbursed in France, if I remember correctly. But I think your other point that you made earlier, Mike, is right on, that I think there's some other really key countries, again, whether it's Canada, Brazil, Israel, Australia, there are other countries where I think you'll see a lot more activity internationally that may be a bit more rapid than the bit of decline, as you talked about, that's happening in Europe. So I think it's, and I think it's probably easier than learning all those different languages. I'll go back to my other point. I think it's finding the right people in those countries to either hire or partner with, because you're just not going to be able to do it alone from here with all the other things you've got to worry about in running your companies.
And I'd say that for high technology, high cost, highly sophisticated medical therapies, the major market's still Europe and the United States. I think the European and United States healthcare systems, reimbursement systems, pricings are going to come closer and closer. We're going to increasingly cover more people. The Europeans are running into more cost problems in their healthcare system. Even though they're at 9–10% of GDP and we're 19%, they're trying to cap it. So they're going to deal with cost problems, as are we. And I think they're going to be increasingly looking for cost effectiveness, solutions to extend life, not just new technologies. So I think they're going to become more and more similar, and I don't think that's a trend that can stop. It's just too demographic. It's too much with technology. Outside the United States, I think the big opportunities, India, China, are for low-cost therapies to treat hundreds of millions of people that do not today, nor will for a long time, have access to a $30,000 deep brain stimulator procedure. There's big opportunities there, but you got to tune it for those populations. And I think those are the two big sort of 5-year trends.